George Floyd was a 46-year-old black man killed by a police officer who knelt on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, all because Mr. Floyd was accused of using a counterfeit $20 bill. The officer did not remove his knee from Mr. Floyd's neck after he was unconscious for well over a minute, and he still did not remove his knee even after paramedics arrived on the scene. Many wonder how another unarmed black man can die at the hands of the police. Today, I am here to persuade you to put an end to systemic racism in America. According to the proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences, 1 in every 1,000 black men can be expected to be killed by the police. First, I will go over the problems associated with systemic racism. Second, I will explain why this has persisted for so long. And third, I will discuss the solutions that can be implemented in order to put an end to systemic racism in America. Let's start by going over the problems. Systemic racism has many serious implications. 2 serious problems are the effects on the healthcare system and poverty. First, let's talk about the healthcare system. In an article published in Time International in June 2020, it stated that Black Americans are subjected to substandard healthcare, which makes them more vulnerable to death and disease. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die during childbirth, partly due to lack of access to care. Access to care is a big issue in the American healthcare system, and minority groups often fall at the bottom of the totem pole. Not only is access an issue, but the quality of care received is subpar compared to their white counterparts. Another problem of systemic racism is poverty. In an article published in American Psychological Association in 2019, it stated that structural forms of racism contribute to a system of economic stratification in which minority children are disproportionately likely to be born in poverty and in turn remain poor as adults. Federal policies were put in place in the 20th century which prohibited Black Americans from receiving loans in order to buy homes, which then made it difficult to establish generational wealth. Clearly, poverty is a problem associated with systemic racism, as well as care in the healthcare system. Now that we've gone over the problems, let's discuss the causes of systemic racism. Systemic racism has been developed over the entire history of the United States. Systemic racism is perpetuated through social learning and hypercriminalization. First, let's talk about how systemic racism is socialized. In an article published in the National Library of Medicine in 2018, it stated that racism acts as a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on social interpretation of how one looks, and this saps the strength of the whole society. No one is born inherently racist, and racism is not solely due to prejudice or the discriminatory actions of one person. Racism is so deeply rooted in American society that it takes form even when no one is actively being racist. Speaking of deep roots in society, let's go on to the other cause, hypercriminalization. Systemic racism has been able to persist due to the criminalization of Black and brown people. A recent statistic published in The Hill in 2020 was that Black people are 5 times more likely to be arrested than white. Not only are Black people more likely to be arrested, but they are more likely to be convicted and serve longer sentences for the same crimes that white people commit. The issue of hypercriminalization can be traced all the way back to the 13th Amendment. Imprisonment was a way to keep former slaves who recently had been freed oppressed. Clearly, there are many factors involved in the origin of systemic racism, 2 of which being the socialization of racism and hypercriminalization. Now that we've discussed the causes, let's dive into some of the solutions which can end systemic racism. 2 solutions which can be implemented are overcoming biases and assumptions in professional settings and making real policy change. As we discussed, the healthcare system encompasses many inequalities due to systemic racism. It is up to those in power to do something about it. In an article published in the BMG Medical Journal in 2020, it stated that medical professionals play an important role in tackling racial injustices, both on the individual level and in leadership roles. Medical professionals can work in the communities most affected by health inequalities in order to reduce the negative impacts of systemic racism on health. Another way in which we can end systemic racism is through policy change. The American Civil Liberties Union published in 2021 that action can be taken through voting rights, student debt, and fair housing. Social services are just one way in which inequalities that so many face can be lessened. Systemic racism can be combated through the conquering of biases and assumptions and through policy change. To wrap up, today I persuaded you to put an end to systemic racism in America. I did this first by discussing the problems associated with systemic racism, second, the causes, and third, the solutions we can use in order to put an end to this issue. Black and brown people are tired of seeing another person's name become a hashtag after they are killed by the police. We all can incorporate anti-racist actions into our lives in order to put an end to systemic racism, and it is our duty to do so to end this life-threatening issue.